I hold in my hand a very long list of attempts by various peoples against the Jewish nation and religion, ranging from forced conversions, Torah and Talmud burnings, expulsions, property confiscations, being burned at the stake, slavery, pogroms, I don't know really how you say it, mob violence, imprisonment, forcing Jews to wear badges, the Inquisitions, torture, public executions, and lynchings. From that all the way to gathering Jewish men, women, and children, locking them and their Torah scrolls inside their synagogues and burning them alive, while crusaders marched around the burning buildings singing, "Christ, we adore thee," over the screams of the peoples, of course. To the Holocaust, in plural, of millions, and yes, it happened several times over the years, not just once in Germany. So this is a rather long list that I printed out. It's all single-spaced, small print. I don't know if you can tell, but it's pretty thick. And this is just 2,000 years worth. Anyway, let's look at some of the attempts to annihilate the Jewish race and religion from the list. We'll start with the First Jewish War, which was from 66 to 73 CE, so that was first century, right? Josephus wrote that 1.2 million Jews died and 97,000 Jews were enslaved, and that's just in his area. Anthony Byatt, I guess that's how you say his name, argues that only 2.2 million people lived in the area at the time. If he is correct, then a minimum of 50% of the Jews in the Jewish world were wiped out in less than 10 years. 50%. Stop and think about it a minute. You're in the Jewish world. You're where the Jewish temple is. You're where the Jewish people are from, for many generations at this point. The Romans did not immediately start building summer homes in Judea when they took the place over. There weren't really all that many Romans there. They were just the ones in charge. You follow? Most of the people in the area were in fact Jews. In the Second Jewish War, which was also called the Kitos War, it went from 115 to 117 CE. The Jewish communities of Cyprus, Cyrene, and probably others were emptied permanently, and the surviving Jews were expelled to the far eastern edges of Judea. It is estimated that 500,000 Jews were murdered. At this point, we have gone from a population of 2.2 million down to 1 million, and from 1 million down to 500,000. In the Third Jewish War, also called the Bar Kokhba Revolt, from 132 to 135 CE, at least 580,000 Jews were murdered. 50 fortified Jewish towns and 985 Jewish villages were utterly destroyed. Thousands more died because of the famine and disease which followed the war. With this in mind, we can now know that the vast majority of the Jews on our planet were exterminated between these three wars. Per capita, it was a much larger scale massacre than the Holocaust of World War II. As you can imagine, it took a while for the Jewish population to recover. So we're going to jump forward 1,000 years. Not that they weren't murdering Jews all along. It's just we're going to jump forward to get big numbers. In 1033, in a place called Fez, which is close to Morocco, 6,000 Jews were murdered. In 1066, 4,000 Jews were murdered in the Granada Massacre. More massacres followed in 1276 and 1465 in the same place. The First Crusade in 1096 was supposed to be an attempt to recapture the Holy Land from the Muslims. Pope Urban II initiated a military attempt to aid the Byzantine Empire, which had recently lost a whole lot of ground to the Turks, which led to the Rhineland massacres, a series of massacres of Jews by German Christians along the Rhine and Danube. Is that Danube? Something like that, rivers. The Second Crusade in 1147 was an attempt to regain Edessa from the Zengi dynasty that somehow led to the Jews in France being subjected to a series of massacres. What the two had to do with each other, I don't know. The First Shepherd's Crusade of 1251, also known as the Seventh of the Crusades, led to many expulsion of the Jewish people. The Edict of Expulsion, decreed by King Edward I on July 8th of 1290, remained in effect until the end of the Middle Ages. The Second Shepherd's Crusade of 1320 was an attempt to help the Reconquista of Iberia, but did not gain support from the church, so they killed Jews in France and Aragon instead. In 1391, the attempted massacre of all Jews in Spain began, and it lasted until 1492, when all surviving Jews in Spain were ordered to leave. The massacre became known as the pogroms, I guess that's how you pronounce that word, of 5151. That's a Jewish calendar date. Pogroms were the predecessor to what we know in America as Jim Crow laws. These laws forced Jews into specific areas called ghettos and segregated the Jews to certain public areas and facilities. They forbade Jews to carry weapons, they could not vote, they could not own property, and they were forced to pay taxes that no one else had to pay, etc., etc. In 1396, 100,000 Jews were expelled from France. In 1421, thousands of Jews were expelled from Australia. Many of the expelled Jews fled to Poland, and you know what happened to them once the Nazis came. In the middle 1300s, the plague devastated Eurasia, killing somewhere between 75 and 200 million people. Rumors were spread about Jews poisoning the water wells and causing the plague. This led to something called Black Death persecutions, which were a series of Jewish villages being destroyed and untold numbers of Jews being murdered. In the Strasbourg massacre, 900 Jews were burned alive and the rest burned out of, or run out of town. By the way, the plague hadn't even hit this place, but the rumors were powerful enough to move the people to violence and murder. In 1679, all the Jews of Yemen were expelled during what is now called the Mazda exile. Let's jump ahead to the 1800s Italy. In Italy, Jews were required to attend church services designed to get them to convert to Christianity. This was a law. This lasted until the 1840s. In the 1870s, Jews were only allowed to live in places called ghettos. It was illegal to convert from Christianity to Judaism. Jews were often forcibly baptized and then made to follow Christianity to avoid being separated from their families. So what they did was they forced the children to be baptized, and once you're baptized, you had to live by law according to the Christian faith. If your family did not then convert and follow Christianity with you, you being a child, you were taken from your family by law. From 1821 to 1829, during the Greek War of Independence, thousands of Jews were massacred for some reason. In 1839, a mob from Meshed, which is in Iran, burned down the synagogue in the Jewish quarter, which is a special name for ghetto, and destroyed the Torah scroll, known as the Al-Adad. Do you hear Allah in it? Al-Adad incident. It ended with the forced conversion of all Jews in that area to Islam. All of them. Convert or die. The Damascus affair in 1840 occurred when a French monk disappeared in Damascus. The Jews were accused of using him as a human sacrifice. Many Jewish adults and children were subsequently arrested and tortured. After this event, pogroms against Jews were widespread, and ultimately led to a massacre in Baghdad in 1828 and in Bar Furush in 1867. In May of 1882, temporary laws against Jews were enacted by Alexander III, who was Emperor of Russia at the time. These temporary laws became known as the May Laws, but remained in effect for more than 30 years. In the following years, more discriminatory laws were passed. Quotas were passed which limited the number of Jews admitted to high schools and universities. These laws were constantly being revised, and in 1887, these quotas were tightened in and out of the Pale, which is the Russian word for Jewish quarter, i.e. ghetto, and resulted in half-empty schools. Many Jews were left with no choice but to leave Russia in order to receive an education. The maximum amount of Jewish doctors in the army, this is in Russia, was not to exceed 5%. In 1891, about 20,000 Jews were deported from Moscow, and their new synagogue was closed. In 1892, the laws were implemented banning Jewish participation in local elections. The so-called town regulations of 1892 took away the right of Jews to elect or be elected to town dumas, dumas meaning local government. That way, the minority Russians held control over the majority Jews. Now we move into the 1900s. In 1920 and 21, the Nebi Musa, or Jerusalem riots, broke out. Muslims began rioting against the right of Jews to breathe air. In 29, the Arab riots, also known as the 1929 massacre, ended the Jewish town of Hebron with the killing of 29 Jews. In June of 41, the Muslims attacked the Jews in Baghdad, killing 180 and wounding 240. 586 Jewish businesses were looted, and 99 Jewish homes were destroyed. From 41 to 45, 6 million European Jews were murdered, about two-thirds of the Jewish population in the Nazi Holocaust. Let's move to anti-Semitism a little closer to home. In 58, the Hebrew Benevolent Congregation, which was Atlanta's oldest synagogue, was blown up with 50 sticks of dynamite. In 1960, after throwing a bomb that did not explode into Temple Beth Israel, a 16-year-old then opened fire on the congregants as they ran out of the building. In 77, a white supremacist opened fire on the Brit Shalom Knesset Israel synagogue. In 84, talk radio host Alan Berg was murdered in his driveway in Denver. 4 men were arrested, but only 2 of them were convicted for civil rights violations. No one was convicted for murder. In 85, Charles Goldmark, his wife, and their 2 sons were murdered in their home because they were Jewish. In 86, a 24-year-old rabbinical student was murdered for being Jewish. In 1991, black-on-Jewish violence erupted after a Jewish man accidentally hit and killed a black child. The media presented the riots as coming from both sides of the community, but the truth was that it only came from the black population. In 94, a Lebanese immigrant man opened fire on a van full of Jewish students. He later admitted that he did it because they were Jewish. In 99, a man opened fire on the North Valley Jewish Community Center in Granada Hills, which is in Los Angeles. He later told the FBI that he wanted his actions to be a wake-up call to Americans to kill Jews. In 06, a Muslim man opened fire at the Seattle Jewish Federation. In 09, a white supremacist opened fire on the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. In 2014, a former leader of the KKK opened fire at the Jewish Community Center and at the Village Shalom, which was a Jewish retirement center. He got both places. In 18, a man opened fire at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, killing 11. Meanwhile, back at the Maccabean Ranch, the style of the letters of the Maccabees can be called dramatic, pathos-laden adulation. Pathos is a style of persuasion directed at human emotion. It is the democratic way to get people to vote for him. Thus, the style of writing in the Maccabees was intentionally filled with overstated, listen to this, overstated hyperbolic exaggeration. I came up with that myself. It even crosses the line into man worship at times. Of Yehuda, the Maccabee, it says, and I quote from 1 Maccabees 3:7. This is what it says. He, speaking of Yehuda, he grieved also many kings and made Yaakov glad with his acts, and his memory is blessed forever. His memory is blessed forever. Wow, that is idol worship, also known as man worship. Were they trying to make him a superhero, maybe a saint? No, he was being elevated to the rank of a god. Even so, this does not mean that the basic historical information is not true, right? It's a writing style that was very popular during this time. A clear example passed down to us of a historical document being told in a self-serving, self-elevating style comes from the telling of the fight for the Swiss independence. In his book, Judaism of the Second Temple Period, Volume 2, The Jewish Sages and Their Literature, David Flusser, as translated by Azan Yadin, wrote the following. So this is a quote from his book. We find a parallel case in the very agenda-driven, I say agenda-driven because the text actually said tendinacious. I think that's how you say it. I don't even know. But that means agenda-driven. So we find a parallel case in the very agenda-driven legend surrounding the early days of Swiss independence and its struggle against tyranny. These historical narratives give the impression of a truly epic struggle. So it is no wonder that First Maccabees tell of the early stages of the revolt, like the tales of the Swiss independence, inspire authors, composers, artists, and sculptors from one generation to the next. But scholars have already established that the legends of the harsh anti-Swiss decrees and the daring deeds of the Swiss in their struggle are not historically accurate, but first and foremost richly imagined. Flusser went on to say, there is no evidence to suggest that Antiochus preferred one god over the others, or that he sought to effect religious reform in all the countries of his domain, or dominion, as it says. To be sure, it is clear that Antiochus did indeed issue cruel decrees against the temple, the Jews, and the Torah. See 2 Maccabees 6:1-7, 1 through 7. And they gave rise to a new phenomenon, Jewish martyrology. I find it both interesting and contradictory that Flusser states there is no evidence, while discussing the actual evidence he says does not exist, i.e. First Maccabees. That is the evidence. But he says there is no evidence. Further, contradiction comes from Flusser. His use of First and Second Maccabees as evidence, i.e. a definite source throughout, a definitive source throughout all of his writing. He's using it as evidence, but there he said it wasn't evidence. Whatever, man. Many scholars have attempted to argue why they believe that certain or even all of the stories of the Maccabees are not real, credible, and or reliable. The main reason for arguments against First Maccabees is because it does not tell of the death of Antiochus until after it speaks of the dedication of the temple. While, on the other hand, Second Maccabees tells the story of the death of Antiochus before it tells about the dedication of the temple, which in fact is the order that it took place. Thus, since these scholars had no clue that chronology, or that the chronological order did not exist among Jewish culture until circa the 1st century CE, and even then only among the Hellenized, non-Hebrew speaking, Plato-educated Gentiles of Jewish descent. Their arguments are not only wrong, but utterly without merit. In the end, First Maccabees was without a doubt originally written in Hebrew and horribly translated into Greek. That said, it is clear that Second Maccabees was originally written in Hebrew, but very nicely translated into Greek. In the end, the writing style is clearly epic and follows normal Hebrew storytelling of its time. Thus, there is no reason to doubt the authenticity or authority of the historical information. Still, it would serve us well not to accept the man worship and the other hyperbolic nonsense. Having said all of that, I am not suggesting that some of the historical information isn't wrong, as some of it is, in fact, wrong. However, we must take into account the fact that some information would have taken a very long time to arrive, and the author simply gave the information that was available to him at the time of the writing. That's, now let's take some time to talk about the elephant in the room, because there's this big elephant in this story. First and Second Maccabees actually reveal to us that negotiations for the Jews to regain their temple and their right to live according to the Torah began with Antiochus IV. That's Antiochus Epiphanes, the guy who made this decree in the first place. These two letters reveal to us that same man, after a few skirmishes, had already changed his mind and was trying to maybe change things back to the way they were. It's right there in the story. So Antiochus IV had already started his attempt to ratify all of this, which was actually ratified by his son, Antiochus V. This story actually shows that the temple was not won by a fierce war, but was given back due, at least in part, to the fact that both sides were tired of fighting. It actually says so. Blucher wrote the following: all three of the invasions that, between them, 1 and 2 Maccabees date after the dedication, ended with Lysias's proposal to make peace with the men of Bet Zur and with all their nations, in other words, all the Jews, allowing them to live by their laws as they did before, a proposal accepted by the king. In the parallel account in 2nd Maccabees, which is in chapter 13, verses 1 through 26, the peace reached between Lysias and the Jews is further emphasized. I mean, that comes right out of the story of the Maccabees. They're telling you that the temple was given back via negotiation, not via a war. It's right there in the story. Next, Blucher points out that there are 4 letters written by Antiochus IV and V. And here's what he said: an invasion that also ended with a peace accord. As we will see, to this account were appended 4 authentic letters involving peace negotiations with the Jews. The letters are quoted in 2nd Maccabees 11, 16 through 38. Of these, only the 2nd Maccabees 11, 22, and 26, is cited in the proper context. In it, Antiochus V, son of Antiochus Epiphanes, which is Antiochus IV, of course, writes to Lysias that, and here's the quote, the Jews' temple be restored to them, and that they shall live according to the customs of their ancestors. Blucher's, he later added, even though 2nd Maccabees 11 relates events that follow Antiochus's death, 2 or 3 of the letters preserved in the chapter were written during his, Antiochus IV's, Antiochus Epiphanes, during his reign. 2, maybe even 3 of those 4 letters were written while he was still alive and was still king. These clearly indicate that the negotiations that resulted in the annulment of the decrees began under Antiochus IV, I added that, and indeed were initiated by him, fourth, prior to the dedication of the temple. Are you hearing it? Flusser pointed out that neither 1 and 2 Maccabees nor Josephus quote the anti-Jewish decrees, but then said the following, because it's interesting. If this man really had those decrees, why didn't other people talk about those decrees? We've not seen them. That's not a surprise. A lot of stuff from that time period is lost that we know without doubt existed. And we know that this must have existed because we have the evidence saying that it did. But why was it only this one group talking about it and nobody else? Here's what he says. It is possible that the Jewish authors of the day preferred to ignore the fact that Judah conquered the temple and purified it only after the decrees had been annulled. Perhaps they feared that publicizing the connection between the peace negotiations and the dedication of the temple might dull the glory of this historic event. He also added, as noted, the second of the 4 letters, 2 Maccabees 11:22-26, was written by Antiochus V after his father's death. The young emperor writes to Lysias, whom he addresses as my brother, saying, and here's the quote that's in there, "We have heard that the Jews do not consent to our father's change to Greek customs." So here's evidence that this actually took place, that his father did in fact make this law. Anyways, changed Greek customs. Let me start over. We have heard that the Jews do not consent to our father's change to Greek customs, but prefer their own way of living and ask that their own customs be allowed them. Accordingly, since we choose that this nation also should be free from disturbance, our decision is that their temple be restored to them and that they shall live according to the customs of their ancestors. Flusser then said, even if we account for 164 being a Babylonian leap year and the attendant 1-month lag relative to the Palestinian calendar, it appears that no more than 40 days elapsed between Antiochus IV's death in Elam and the dedication of the temple. So there's 40 days between the death and the dedication. It is highly unlikely that during that short time, the new king could have written a letter that overturned his father's decrees and returned the temple to faithful Jews, and that the letter could have reached Israel and caused Judah to pursue the rededication now permitted by the new king. So even though news of Antiochus IV's death may well have reached Jerusalem prior to the dedication, and mention of it was made in Judah Maccabee's letter to the Jews of Alexandria, the plan to retake the temple must have been formulated earlier under the influence of the peace negotiations that took place toward the end of Antiochus IV's life. Clearly, the second letter in which Antiochus V writes Lysias overturns his father's decree and returning the temple to the Jews is chronologically latest. That's the last thing that happened, in other words. Most likely written after the rededication of the temple. As such, the letter probably does little more than ratify the existing status quo. All right, let's go back to what I think. I fear that this last argument by Flusser is more an attempt to leave the Maccabees praiseworthy than reality, as I doubt the Jews would have waited more than the time it took to get to the temple to begin the process of cleaning it. Lastly, there are 2 things in the story of the Maccabees that stand out to me. First and foremost is the fact that the miracle of lights was never mentioned. In fact, it was not mentioned until a minimum of 600 years after the Maccabean revolt. I think that true scholarship would place a difference of at least 900 years after the revolt. Second is the fact that the Maccabees believed that the time of the ingathering took place once the temple was rededicated, which agrees with the prophecy of Daniel. Concerning this, Flusser wrote the following. After the Hellenized priests were removed, stored, And yes, he called Judaism a cult because every group in this world that practices religious services is in fact a cult. CULT. Not the other word, occult. A space cult. Anyway, the after it was and the temple once again holy for all Jews, it could become the site of pilgrimage for the Jews of the diaspora. It is not surprising then that Judah alludes to the biblical promise of the ingathering of the exiles. He alludes to it a lot. Our history has shown us a few things. First, a significant persecution of the Jewish people takes place approximately every 5 to 10 years. Second, each time a Jewish population reaches into the millions, a Holocaust has followed until now, because we're back in the millions, by the way. History has also taught us that often Jews have to fight for the right to breathe air. Often Jews have to fight for the right to live in our own country. Often Jews have to fight for the right to own a Torah scroll. Often Jews have to fight for the right to wear fringe. Often Jews have to fight for the right to not cut their beards. Often Jews have to fight for the right to worship our God our way. Often Jews have to fight for the right to build and maintain our tabernacle. Often Jews have to fight for the right to build and maintain our synagogues. Often Jews have to fight for the right not to participate in pagan holidays. Often Jews have to fight for the right not to have idols in our homes. Often Jews have to fight for the right to be Jewish. What gave Antiochus the right to take these things away from our forefathers? Well, it was his position and his belief that he was better than others. What gives our current governments, the media, social justice warriors, and even family members the right to take away our rights, our beliefs, our religion, our freedom, our very thoughts? The same thing. Our Gentile family members may not want us dead, but they want us to stop growing our beards and stop wearing our fringes. They want us to work on Saturday if it's convenient for them. They demand that we participate in their pagan holidays and customs, and if we don't, we are then compared to a narcissistic mass murderer who tainted Kool-Aid with cyanide, killing hundreds of innocent men, women, and children. It would seem that Jews have to fight for everything. Some of us have to fight for the right not to have Christmas trees in our homes. We have to fight for the right not to have Christmas lights on our homes. Why? Because we are related to people who believe they are of a higher authority and are of a sounder mind and are of a superior knowledge. To sum it up, their wants, needs, and desires trump those of the Jews. One thing we can conclude from all human history is that war can only win us our freedom to breathe and live according to our religious belief while at the very best. After all the skirmishes, and yes, they were just skirmishes, were finally over, chapter 7 of 1 Maccabees says the following: Thus the land of Judah was at rest a little while. Thus the land of Judah was at rest for how long? Thousands and bazillions, for a little while. Why have so many people tried to wipe us from the face of the earth? Have the Jews brought it on themselves? Well, if they have, do rape victims cause their own rape? No. Rapists rape. Murderers murder. That's what they do. Murderers murder. That's what they do. The Bible teaches us that those who are of the world, in other words, those who do not obey God, will hate God and his children. It's that simple. Many wise rabbim have taught that if people hate God, they will hate those who follow them. They have also taught that people will know the followers of God by their love one for another. People will know the followers of God by their love one for another. I think the mistake in the Maccabean revolt was their belief that they should wage a physical battle. In other words, they believed that their battle was with flesh and blood. Do you see it? To put it in a Christian term, the Maccabees thought that their battle was with flesh and blood. Yes, what I just said. I think that the way we wage war is through prayer to God, obedience to his laws, and our love for one another. After all, the actual truth of the dedication of the temple is that it took place because of a negotiation, not because of a war. Our world is truly out of control. Once our government turned our schools into re-education camps, America began the slow descent towards socialism and communism. Did you know that there has never been a time when a country converted to socialism and or communism that millions were not immediately massacred? It's never happened. That which once was a joke has now become an absolute truth. How do you know a politician is lying? His lips are moving. How do you know if a celebrity is lying? His lips are moving. How do you know if someone in the media is lying? His lips are moving, or hers. Further, how do you know that these people know they are lying? How do you know they know they're lying? Well, everyone is attempting to scream over the top of the other. We live in an age where young people followed Bernie Sanders by the thousands because they thought he represented some higher form of consciousness. But he's a politician. And what do we know to be true about the moving lips of a politician? Do we remember? Mr. Sanders kept declaring things to be immoral, as if he represented some moral high ground. And the young people took that for truth. Our youth have grown up in a world where morality does not exist in books, TV, movies, school, video games, the internet, or social media. There is an old saying, youth is wasted on the young. The reason why this saying holds true is because the young do not yet possess enough life experience and education to discern between truth and agenda. There is a chance that many, if not most, will never be able to discern these things since high schools and colleges no longer teach critical thinking. Students these days are taught to study that which they have been told to believe, and thus, what they study always proves that which they have been told. The youth of today are looking for something to follow. They are looking for something they can believe in, something they know beyond a doubt is real. Not only that, but those of us who are of the older persuasion are longing for a return to the time when truth, honesty, integrity, dependability, responsibility, and the like were all attributes, not only to aspire to, but were also known to be attainable. Yes, we can attain this. That's what we used to know. Why don't we Jews start a new Maccabean revolt? A revolt against lies, immorality, and other various bad things. But, and this is a huge but, I'll help myself out. Let's fight the battle within ourselves. If we believe that something is a must for salvation, then we should see to it that we do that something. And let's just let everybody else do their thing. This approach may not get others to stop forcing their sensibilities on us, but it would give us the moral high ground in that we would not be hypocrites attempting to force our beliefs and customs on others while complaining about others doing the same to us. Shalom, y'all.